So I am really pleased to introduce this next guest. Is Brian Hogley. He is the managing partner and founder of Side Channel. Side Channel is our title sponsor, which means they've contributed an awful lot of money to help put this event on. We are so grateful for them. It's a terrific company. Brian and his team have been in the trenches for years, meeting the security needs of both the public and the private sector. So let me turn the mic over to Brian to introduce our next panel. Thank you, Brian.
Are we good here? Thank you so much. So, small world, Brian Herman and I actually bumped into each other earlier, and it turns out the program that I was running at Pentagon under Obama's second term is now part of his program up at Fort Meade. So who knew the DoD, as large as it was, is actually a small world. I thought that was funny. Anyway, thank you so much for having us. We're excited to be a title sponsor. First conference we've sponsored, and second conference in person of the year, so I'm so glad to actually see people in person. I'm sure we all are as well. I have the honor of introducing the moderator, Ryan Hindorn, and our panelists for the Zero Trusts Given Cloud Strategies for Security and Compliance. Who's ready for that? Yeah. So with that, I would like to introduce Ryan, the moderator, and our panelists, David Lago, Chris Hughes, and Patrick Perry. Gentlemen, please come on up, and let's get this discussion going.
Great. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I'm really honored to be up here with no hyperbole, some of my industry heroes. So I brought my cheat cards back up just in case I lose my nerve here. But no, I've got some great questions for you all. I think you represent a very diverse set of experience and interests as it pertains to both Zero Trust and cloud. But maybe before we get started, if we could just go down. Dave, do you mind just saying a couple words of introduction about yourself?
Sure. I'm Dave Lago. I'm the product manager for something called DoD Cloud ISC. I'm from the DISA hack. The hack is about providing best value hosting and compute services. We're one of the offerings there.
Yeah, Patrick Perry, Director of Strategy for Zscaler. I've been here for about 2.5 years, and before that, I spent 22 years in the Army.
Chris Hughes, co-founder and CISO of Acquia. Prior to that was active duty Air Force, civilian with the Navy, and civilian with FedRAMP as well.
Awesome. So I've got a lot of questions, and I expect the audience and the virtual attendees probably do too, so we'll just get right into it. My first question kind of piggybacks off of what Dr. Herman was saying about the term Zero Trust. So you all have probably heard this criticism before. Does Zero Trust really mean zero? And second question, is it possible to design a system today that has no implicit trust? Anyone can weigh in.
I'll jump in. I think it obviously doesn't mean zero. It means no implicit trust, and it also can be like a negative cultural impact, because it gives a bad perception to people that don't understand the term. And the question was, can you design a system that has no implicit trust?
Can you build a zero trust architecture today?
You could, but you need some level of trust to perform the activities that we're talking about. So you could, have no trust at all, but you're ultimately going to need to establish that to impact, the operations that we're talking about.
Yeah, I'll just add in. I think the term zero trust obviously gets a bad name because there is no, perfect situation that you could ever achieve. I think more importantly is it's zero trust in the static environment of security. Back in the day, again, security was much more looked at as set and forget. Hey, meet these standards, meet these things. When a new change comes out, then we'll do it. But it was never as proactive as it needed to be. And now what we're looking at is, again, the environment, the controls, the measures of success can't be implicitly trusted either. It has to constantly evolve. And therefore, to your second question, can you achieve it? I don't think you can really achieve it because it's an arrow that never ends. You're always just racing with it. So you have to keep that evolutional mindset, in place when going for it.
And I'll say maybe it's one or two trust. Does it make sense from a return on investment perspective, to build these out? I think we need to maximize and kind of prioritize around that.
Absolutely. So I know we've kind of already discussed Zero Trust as a journey and as a transition. Any quick tips on making that journey if an organization is starting from scratch? Where do you begin?
Yeah, so I'll jump in first. I think it's important to figure out where your opportunities lie to go after it. Every organization is going to be different. Some organizations, somewhere in their strategy already are setting forth those steps to move in the identity evolution, or it's the network evolution, or it's the SOC, in the analytics side. But you kind of have to align it to your environment, your strategy, because as already stated, everybody has to buy in. You have so much more involved now that if you try to just make this framework that everybody just follows step 1 through 7, it might not align to that organizational strategy. So I would offer the first important step is where is your organization with its normal evolution of security, and find the opportunity to start implementing zero trust aspects into those parts in line.
Yeah, I think some of the other recommendations made about buy-in, just getting executive buy-in and educating them at a level that they can understand is a great thing to do. So you can get that executive buy-in to go about the organization and enforce the things you want to try to enforce or implement the things you want to implement. And obviously it's going to be different for every organization, like he said, but just starting with kind of a framework of reference, like this is a maturity model that we've discussed, can help orient you. What are the pillars we're trying to address? What are the activities we're trying to address? They could be tech agnostic, but what are we trying to accomplish?
And I'd add, set expectations is not something we're going to flip a switch and be done with, overnight.
So you're talking about buy-in, and Dr. Herman was talking about making people uncomfortable. Do you all have any personal experiences, whether within government or in industry, around trying to articulate, why, maybe not why are we moving away from this old model, but what does the new model look like? And any tips or strategies on how to overcome objections or lack of understanding there?
I'll jump in again. I experienced that honestly early on with cloud and cybersecurity. Among my cybersecurity peers, what do you mean we're going to use someone else's infrastructure? We can't put our data there. It was an educational campaign to help them understand what the capabilities of cloud can bring and why we're doing it and how it could be even more secure when done correctly. The same thing with zero trust. If you look at the zero trust strategy from the federal government, it talks about making systems internet accessible. That's really scary to cybersecurity professionals. But helping them understand the flaws of the VPN, castle and moat kind of old way of doing things, and just helping them educating folks, in a way that comes across as not being condescending, but trying to help uplift folks and understand what are the things we're trying to accomplish, what are the things wrong with the old way of doing things, and why does this matter?
Dave, question for you. So I know one of the big drivers of zero trust is obviously remote work. What can you tell us about what it's like to work remotely as a government employee?
Sure. So during the whole pandemic, I've been to the office, I think, 2 or 3 times. And I will tell you, as a federal employee, I have 2 laptops. Right? I have one that sits on the DoD corporate VPN, and one that does not. And there is a big problem with that I haven't heard mentioned today, which is there's no place to put your glass of water. And I've knocked it over twice. The service desk literally hates me. But that'll kind of give you a feel for what the federal workforce is going through right now. And so the one on the VPN, you can imagine, right, is for traditional kind of system access that you would think of, right, the traditional kind of things you're doing on the corporate network. The other one is a MacBook, and it is using the latest kind of SaaS tools that you typically find in a commercial office space. So to me, what we're really talking about here with zero trust is merging those things into one laptop and one user experience. Dr. Herman brought it up in his presentation before that really matters. There's a whole movement right now about fix our computers. Yep. We have this really robust workforce. We have a really smart workforce. We've got to empower that workforce. We can't have them, waiting on pages to load and things like that. We have to give them, modern tools if we, expect them to succeed.
So let's pivot a little bit and talk specifically about cloud and zero trust in the context of cloud. 2-part question. First part, does zero trust, or at least today's implementations, imply using cloud services? And regardless of your response on that, what does a cloud-first strategy for zero trust architecture look like today?
Can you jump first?
You go ahead.
Again, everybody's going to think of it differently. What I'd offer is, again, it's what you're trying to go for and how quick and where your environment is. It's already, to your point, is it cloud first? Is your organizational strategy a cloud first strategy? So security should try to fit that into to it as well, because again, if that is the initial operational strategy, the business strategy, then your security strategy has to be in line. But a lot of organizations aren't going to be ready for that. So you really have to kind of double click into your environment, what parts of your environment could be cloud first, I would offer that, cloud basically also is synonymous with more mature delivery. You get a lot more out of cloud. It's more monetized. You get more capability. It's like mowing your yard. If you have a really big yard, you might go to a mow service that can do it cheaper than it would cost you to constantly mow your yard. It's the same kind of model. I think the pizza, shared responsibility model also kind of breaks that down. Where you own things and where you own that risk changes when you move to a cloud model. So it doesn't, Zero Trust doesn't imply you have to go cloud to get to Zero Trust, but I would offer it within your greater business strategy, it would probably fit in to be a more mature Zero Trust model faster.
And I'd add cloud is, obviously a big part of that, ecosystem going forward. We will always have something on-prem. We know that's always going to be the case. Something that our office has worked on, and I'm the product manager of, is this DoD Cloud IAC, which are templates to help customers, kind of adopt the cloud, in a standard way.
Can you tell me more about those configurations? Are we talking about like landing zones or secure configuration baselines? What does that look like?
Yeah, the engineering effort that we realize customers are going through to adopt the cloud, that sometimes it takes years for them to do, the engineering, and it really takes the focus away, from their mission application and their data, which is what really matters. So we said, yes, can we kind of build that underlying platform? This is focused on kind of the next gen managed services. And build that for them so that they don't have to. And we went through a process to get, an ATO, and we have common controls that customers inherit that helps them go through their ATO process. As part of those baselines, we also have kind of the CSP native tooling that's in there, things like WAF and DDoS protection and API management. So there are kind of templates to build out this architecture. Now, I'll admit it's a partial architecture. It is not, the end-to-end, does not include, the device and, the larger part, but it is a starting point.
Gotcha. Maybe a question for you, Chris, either on this topic or another one. So Patrick really briefly mentioned a shared responsibility model, and obviously a lot of us here are interested in compliance and compliance requirements. Could you tell us a little bit more about the shared responsibility model and what we should be thinking about, maybe in context of Zero Trust?
Yeah, I think it actually touches on what Dave was just talking about, the infrastructure as code. I know a lot of people here work in the DIB rather than DoD systems, like many of us have, for example. But taking those lets you get to that reference architecture that was mentioned earlier, for example, unless you focus on your core competencies, unless the cloud provider focuses on their core competencies, so you can deliver value faster and also offload things that you're not necessarily particularly skilled at, right? Whether it's workforce or resource constraints. So I think that's super valuable. And then the shared responsibility model in the context of Zero Trust is, we have frameworks like FedRAMP and SOC 2 and other methods to go about assessing the cloud provider that you can have a level of assurance or trust, that they have met certain things in terms of security controls, maturity around practices. So going through and vetting providers is massively helpful, and then also just understanding, okay, they're doing X, now I need to focus on Y. Because it'll never be a 100% end-to-end solution. It's always going to be a mutual partnership in that context.
Patrick, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, shared responsibility, I think, is one of the favorite topics that are always brought up when it comes to any kind of cloud service. And it's one of my favorite ones because I think responsibility, the word responsibility is always kind of, misnomered and misaligned to the idea of accountability and how those things kind of work together. And, as Chris pointed out, you got to find where the most value to your organization is when it comes to sharing responsibility. And it really comes to what can you not be accountable for, and where can you offload that risk at the right cost? There's no reason to spend a lot of money and a lot of effort, and more importantly, a lot of your human capital on maintaining a responsibility that's bringing you very low value. To me, it's black and white as that when you kind of figure out where you should fit your shared responsibility, environment is. I also don't like the term shared responsibility because I think when you think of the term shared, it really means ducking responsibility because you can always blame the responsibility. Oh man, I thought I was sharing that with you. It's more of a distributed responsibility. There still has to be lines that are very clear that people know what they're responsible for. When you try to say two people are responsible for something, nobody's responsible for it.
That sounds right. One thing that we've all talked about is separating your security mindset from the data plane and the control plane. Would anyone mind describing what that means for the audience and any thoughts on why that's important?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking like cloud-native ecosystems in particular. Like the control
Yep.
plane is obviously going to let you do administrative activities that can impact not only you, but maybe potentially other tenants in the environment. So that's critical. And then the data plane is obviously your workloads and things of that nature, where you may have sensitive data transiting. So it's critical to keep an eye on both of those and understand like what you can and can't control. You know, going back to the shared responsibility model, what is the cloud provider controlling? What am I controlling? And then obviously it gets even more complex when you look at like Kubernetes and containerized environments. You got service mesh and things like that add to that complexity too.
Yeah, and just add, and if you can have a, as much as possible, standardized kind of least privilege model, around that, yeah.
Dave, from where you sit, or for you guys as well, I know a big problem, or a transitional problem at least, in adopting zero trust is that we're starting to do some cool things in these silos, right? But you really need an enterprise strategy. Otherwise, kind of what's the point, right? So how do you see us bridging the gap from deploying zero trust principles in various silos and unifying them under an enterprise strategy?
I'll jump in real quick. And mainly because my last 5, 6, 7 years in the military, we were really inundating ourselves with this idea of ITSM, and really trying to become more of an efficient IT environment. And unfortunately, it also created these silos. A lot of ITSM frameworks will show you, you're going to have your applications silo, and you're going to have your infrastructure silo, and you might have this thing called a cloud silo, even though they really didn't know what that silo looked like a cloud. And then you have like your endpoint or your user experience, but you had all these silos. And unfortunately, security was its silo. And it was a lot more focused on compliance and then telling the other silos what they needed to do to be secure. But it wasn't this integrated thing. I think what, again, Zero Trust is bringing to bear is, what we would like to call in the military all the time is this cross-functional team thing. Back in the day, me personally, I never thought of identity as a security function. Identity was nothing more than granted, it was my credentialing system, but it really wasn't part of my security apparatus. While today, you can't talk about security. To your point, identity is almost a new perimeter. You can't talk about security without calling out identity, but that's almost brand new. It's never been a part of old architectures. So to see that evolution and where cross-functional teams are really the only way to go forward, I think this is realigning. In that kind of construct, again, I'm not going to have just my, endpoint team that works in their own silo.
Right.
But how do I bring these guys together to where we're really creating a security ecosystem?
Yeah, and I'll add, reference architectures definitely matter, from DoD, CIO, and other organizations. It kind of gives you top cover, if you will, when you're meeting with your SCA rep and you want to build this zero trust solution. If you talk about not running it through the corporate network, they're going to look at you with like you have 3 heads. So having that kind of top cover, I think really helps when you go to implementation. There is something called the CNAP reference architecture that is out there, the cloud native access point, and that's something that has helped us in kind of showing that, hey, there's another way to approach this. So I think it's very important.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that, like, whether you're DoD or a DIB vendor serving the DoD, we talked about the levels of maturity. You had like those 3 levels, right? And it was identifying anomalous behavior, contextual access control, things like that. Like, to touch on the technical aspect, without bringing that all together in a cohesive ecosystem of tools, like, and having that visibility of the entire environment and everything that's operating in it, you're never going to reach those things because you can't see everything at once.
We can do a lot of things in cloud, and that's why we love cloud. But when we're talking about zero trust or we're talking about compliance, what do you all think are some key considerations or differences between the IaaS, infrastructure as a service, and SaaS, software as a service? Are those concepts, do we apply zero trust the same to those different cloud technologies, or is it different?
I think it's different. I've been focusing a lot on SaaS governance and security lately, and like a lot of the activities you talk about, microsegmentation, secure configuration baselines, that's much different in the SaaS context because you control less of the tech stack, right? You don't control the operating system. You don't control the networking, for example. So it's much different in that context, and that's where the shared responsibility model and vetting the SaaS providers comes into play much more because you're controlling less and less of that. But there are some key things that you can do, when it comes to identity, for example, having federation and single sign-on so you don't have identity sprawl in all these SaaS providers. Someone leaves the organization, and they still have access with an email account for their personal email or something, because or even just a user login, right? It never got federated back to the enterprise identity provider, for example. So it's much different in the SaaS context, but the principles still apply. You just need to validate that someone else is doing them versus you doing them in some cases.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to add to it, to Chris's point, it's all about what you can influence. Security is all about what you can influence. SaaS and the internet are prime examples of where you're giving away levels of control and influence on security on one end of the transaction, and you've got to make it up somewhere else. And this is why it's an ecosystem. You're pretty much always going to have a user, an endpoint, a transport, and then a service you're going to in the end. And to your point, SaaS, you've given up a lot of influence of that security posture. And you can validate some of it, but you're still giving up some of it. So you have to kind of make it up with the other parts of that security architecture. So I think it's important to realize, again, as you're aligning your zero trust, strategy, is that transactionally, that whole approach may change based on that level of influence and control. BYOD is another example. Once you introduce BYOD into your environment, you've lost control over something, but you have to make it up somewhere else. And that's the goal of zero trust, in my opinion, is we're not putting our trust in one spot anymore. We're spreading it. It's not a zero-sum game, but you can create levels of efficiency by gaining security in defense in depth in a totally different way.
And maybe I'm naive, but I'm hoping that it's easier to do zero trust at the SaaS layer than it is IaaS. IaaS just seems so much more complex there. But the point Dr. Herman made before about standards, we need to have pre-built connectors, make it easy for customers to adopt these things.
Let's drill into that for a little bit, because I'm interested. I'm hearing you guys say with SaaS, obviously identity is critical, right? So I've got a central identity store. That SaaS product is going to use my identity provider. I'm doing some cool things around conditional access or whatever. I also am aware of the shared responsibilities or distributed responsibilities between me and the vendor, right? But when it comes to telemetry, for example, what should I do, or how should I be thinking about a SaaS product or evaluating that SaaS product in the context of like an ecosystem of the other providers that are going to feed good signals to my architecture?
Going back to like the holistic visibility aspect, what we're discovering, like when you talk about IaaS versus SaaS being more complex or difficult, you're using maybe 2 to 3 IaaS providers, right? We're finding organizations are using tens to hundreds of SaaS providers, and most of the time the IT security team only knows or controls 30% of that. So that's a major problem. But telemetry-wise, it's like just seeing what can you get from the SaaS provider, what can you bring into your environment, like from a SOC perspective, logging perspective, access control and authentication and things like that. Really validating that so you can try to bring all that together for at least the SaaS you're aware of can get you very far.
Chris or Dave, or Patrick, sorry, do you agree or disagree with that? Is there anything else that I can go to my SaaS vendor and say, like, is there a list of questions that'll help me understand, is this going to be a good fit within the context of the rest of my system?
Yeah, I agree with Chris. In the end, it's also about interoperability, and again, it's openness, it's transparency to share with the ecosystem. Is it trying to enclose you into a environment where, I hate to say it, you trust it, or is it a very connective-oriented and open-minded, securely open, but open-minded architecture? So as your SaaS, have a good API architecture, a good API strategy, not only currently, but at where it's going. How is it sharing? What is it willing to share? That level of openness and transparency back into the greater security architecture is just imperative, in my opinion.
Yeah, and to add, I think making sure that it's cost effective, right? So like the cloud egress charges that you get when you're say, okay, I'm going to export all my audit logs. Obviously we can't do that, right? So we need pre-built connectors that also make it cost effective.
And I was just going to add a quick comment. I know Mr. Weiss is going to speak about this later, but in the context of SaaS, there's also an understanding of like what exactly is in this software, right? What dependencies, and if something happens, how will they respond? That's a whole other conversation around supply chain security in the context of zero trust too.
Absolutely. Anyone here willing to wade into the topic of zero trust and OT?
Just to say that it's complex. There's a reason that if you look at this federal zero trust strategy, we've talked about cloud a lot, right? If you do Control F, cloud's probably there, a dozen or more times. Right. And it's because cloud makes it somewhat easier. It's a cohesive ecosystem of connectivity. In OT, you don't have that ubiquitous connectivity, and I think the gentleman from MITRE talked about that a bit. It makes it more complex for sure.
So do we just keep it off to the side and deal with it later, or what does the future of cybersecurity and zero trust look like for OT if you had to look into your crystal ball?
personally, I would look to the ICA, industrial control system experts, who is not me.
Sure.
People like Dragos and other folks that are tackling, DHS, industrial control system security. It's outside my domain of expertise, and it's a really complicated challenge, in my opinion.
Understood.
Yeah, I think it's exactly. It's very complicated in the sense that, again, when you look at the architecture end to end, that Zero Trust is trying to kind of bring it together. OT is in this like island of its own. It doesn't really have an identity. It's very sparse. There's, I would say, very, very vague standards on what to build OT based on, what it's actually collecting, and therefore the connectivities that it has open, that it presents such a large risk that it's probably one of the first things that you should figure out how to tackle.
Yeah.
And at least, compartmentalize its impact, that blast radius, that if something does go wrong, that you're not going to feel it everywhere else. Because what OT, I think, brings to bear in the worst point is a pivot point. It is almost a welcoming pivot point back into your environment if you don't take it serious.
Yeah, and it seems critical, and you could apply most or all of the Zero Trust security design principles to OT. It's just going to look different, right? Segmentation, obviously, like you're saying, but least privilege, least functionality, defense in depth, those all equally apply to OT. It just seems a lot easier at this moment to apply them to cloud-native systems.
Yeah, the scary part is actually, it's a big difference in terms of OT tends to be things like water treatment facilities, things that the impact of that versus like a business system is much scarier.
Absolutely. Changing gears a little bit, what do you all think the government is doing well today as it pertains to Zero Trust?
Well, that one, definitely.
So I was going to share an example. So this baseline that we talked about, the DoD Cloud IAC templates to build out secure cloud environments. So we worked with Transcom, AMC, and during the Afghan evacuation, they were able to build a command and control system to track the evacuees in 16 days with 3 FTEs. So you're thinking about, in DoD, timelines, that's a drop in the bucket, So the part of that success story was being able to leverage, the cloud native technologies there, as opposed to, going through the process of deploying on the corporate network and taking advantage of that. So that was a big success that we were able to have and show value, quickly.
And I'll say, anyone that's worked in or around the government, it's easy to critique, the government. Everyone knows that. But we talked about executive buy-in. When you look at what the government's done around the federal executive order and the subsequent things that have come out of that, like a system maturity model, a federal zero trust strategy, they have the buy-in. They've articulated a strategy. That's much more than many organizations have done.
Yeah.
Now execution is another story.
And the only thing I'll add is getting a little bit more transparency than probably most are used to the government. They're a lot more open about what they're trying to do, where they're trying to go, what the next steps are. Something that, in the past, especially being in the military, we weren't always there. We were always kind of like, hey, I'd like to share something with you, but let's get behind closed doors, and I'm only going to share it with you. While if you really kind of look at the shift, I think it was pointed out from Pete earlier in the talk, that the openness that the government is having with their approach and their strategies, even again, Dr. Herman said, hey, if you want to come talk about exactly what we're kind of doing, let's talk about it. And you tell me when I'm wrong. That is something that I'm really impressed, because it's just what the government is not used to doing.
Let's talk about our favorite subject, compliance, and then we can throw it out to some questions and see where the conversation goes from there. But when we're talking about in the context of a cloud native system, we love that we're able to do all these cool DevOps things, everything as code, et cetera. Do you see a future for policy as code? I know you're talking about the IAC projects. Where can I build in my compliance requirements from the outset when I'm building and deploying these architectures?
So I've worked with the infrastructure as code templates, for Azure with the Space Force in particular, and I know AWS now has that too. You can bake in those compliance requirements so that mission owners, one, they can move faster if they have resource constraints in terms of people or funding, whatever. But you can also bake in that compliance requirement aspect of things so that when they deploy, they're already meeting several compliance checks, and they have an authorization, for example. And if you're a DIB vendor, same concept. You can provide reference architectures that are templatized and aligned with 800.171 or CMMC, and the major cloud providers are working on doing that, so that when you deploy, you're already meeting your compliance requirements. And then policy as code, you can move to enforcement too. If you have configuration changes that are being made that deviate from those states of compliance, you can auto-remediate, for example, back to a known good state. So it's definitely another level of maturity that can be reached.
Yeah, only thing I'll add really is that I think policy and code, and again, all those kind of things are great. I'm always fearful of an easy button. for people. Easy buttons end up, you lose sight and focus on the important things because an easy button just made that easy. So I do hope that the maturity of that process stays with it. Again, what is checking the checker per se, and that kind of stuff.
Well, I'll give my personal opinion. So I think that more could be done kind of on the government side to accelerate ATOs. So the DoD Cloud IC comes with 103, 112 common controls, right? So for a moderate system, that's 25% of them, right? So like 50% of those are process and policy things. Do we really need 400? Can we, kind of narrow that down a little bit? So I think more can be done both on the, the automation side with things like IEC, templates like that, but also, can we accelerate, kind of the ATO process and kind of maximize that?
Yeah. So definitely not an easy button, but certainly an accelerator towards compliance. I know working in the DIB space specifically, when we're talking about cloud, one of the first conversations you have is, hey, there's a difference between your commercial cloud and clouds that have achieved FedRAMP authorization or government cloud. And there's a temptation, I think, for some organizations to say, I'm going to pay a little bit more for the government cloud, now I'm good, right? Like that, now everything, I'm ready for my assessment, but we know that's not the case. One of the things that comes up for me frequently, and I'm thinking about the NIST 800-207 Zero Trust Architecture, sort of an authoritative document at this point for talking about zero trust. In one of the appendices, it talks about a perception, which NIST calls a misperception, that zero trust is out of step with federal guidelines. So specifically, to put this into some concrete terms, in a lot of our requirements, we have requirements around remote access, right? Secure remote access. But what does remote access look like when everything's in the cloud? How do you start to approach some of those, if not inconsistencies, a need to educate maybe an assessor or another authoritative body on how zero trust fits into those requirements?
Yeah, I'll jump real quick in it, just a couple things. I don't think it's in like a violent disagreement with each other. I think it's the interpretation, the way that people have been accustomed to reading the controls and even grading people on the controls is what's going to have to evolve. If it doesn't, they will come in conflict because zero trust looks at things in a certain way, like, again, no VPN. One of the big things. We get away from that idea that there's a trusted and untrusted environment. While multiple NIST controls call out the need, you need a VPN.
Right.
So I think that is like kind of their obvious examples, but really what it comes down to is the interpretation of the controls. Some of the controls will need some word changing because they were written so granular with very specific words that are now out of date, but that's probably normal with any government document. So unfortunately, just like any other government document, the NIST standards probably need to kind of be adjusted to more modern terminology as the modern technology has shifted how we're kind of grading things.
Yeah, and I think it's multifaceted. If you look at like the NSTAC, it's like National Security Telecommunications Agency recommendations to the president around zero trust. They point out that compliance standards in many cases do need to evolve to align with zero trust. So they recognize that it's a problem and it will evolve, but of course, like anything in government, it's going to take time. And then to the workforce, auditing aspect, that can be a major inhibitor to a DIB vendor getting compliant with CMMC, for example, or a DoD system getting an ATO. So I think it comes back to recognizing it's not only a tech problem, we need to bring the workforce along with that and look into things, whether it's Cloud Security Alliance's CCAK, like auditing certification for cloud, doing things to upskill the workforce so that they can understand the technologies involved and the new ways of doing things can do a great service too.
Yeah, that's
So
Dave.
we begin
Please.
the audience participation?
Thank you, Dan.
And let me start as an audience member. You guys are speaking really fast. Really fast. And as a layman, who advises companies who now have the DFARS clause in it and will soon have to measure up to the CMMC standard, I think you just addressed this, but if you could do it a little bit more slowly and a little bit more high up, do I, as a vendor, with the DFARS clause, and then having to meet the CMMC level, whatever that's going to be, do I have to achieve zero trust?
I think if you look at some of the fundamental things that are involved in zero trust, you're going to see those, kind of replicated across your CMMC controls, like MFA, single sign-on, microsegmentation. Those kind of best practices in terms of security maturity are going to be in those security controls. So there's no way to avoid it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm not good at talking slow, so I apologize. or quietly. But
No, you can be as loud as you want.
yeah, I actually checked on that before. But to Chris's point, I think they're kind of one and the same. It's just understanding what zero trust is calling something and then what CMMC or DFARS is calling it. But a lot of those things are actually the same thing. Unfortunately, like everything else in the government, everybody has a way to throw an acronym on every single idea. So unfortunately, we're just kind of speaking past each other, and that's why it's so important. And as long as the interpreters can understand that, you know, the people that are interpreting the rules and they're the ones grading you, the third-party assessors, they're sped up on, okay, hey, I speak Spanish and English, so no matter how you write it for me, I can grade it properly. That's that thing that just has to stay in step, or we're gonna find probably a pretty good slope of slowing down of achieving what we're really trying to, what we're really desiring as the end state.
All right, questions? Yes, sir.
I would love to hear your strategies about two key points. As a technologist in cybersecurity, how do you address and what tools you have to articulate to CFOs? Because zero trust is awesome. I practice it, but it also has a cost associated with. And also, second point is, what's your take on the speed of American companies in the government in order to mitigate and protect ourselves when our actors, threat actors, have a way less shorter cycle between what we procure and all those things, while they could just simply buy something out of the internet, out of the dark web. I'll take an example, Okta. They got hacked by some kids in England. You know, Okta being the identity premier service out there.
Yeah, I think on the CFO front, I hate to use like the old trope of speak the language of the business, but try to communicate, you know, what the impact in financial terms could be. Maybe that would bring, you know, the point home closer to them and help that, you know, be more understandable for them. Like if something did happen, here could be the financial ramifications for the organization, whether regulatory-wise or customer trust or loss of revenue, those kind of things. But do it in a way that's not going to be fear-mongering, which is difficult, right? And then on the you know, identity or the malicious actor side of things, you know, focus on the activities like, you know, not to throw a ding at post-quantum cryptography, for example, but most of your compromises that are successful are going to get across through phishing and lack of MFA. You know, focus on those things that really address most of the, you know, data breaches that we see versus some of the really high-level maturity things right out the gate. Focus on those more like down the road on your roadmap, for example.
All right, here, another question?
You take the next.
Hey, how you doing? Martin Lewis, ARS. Hey, thanks for all of your inputs. Just a question about risk acceptance with Zero Trust. What have you found as specifically DoD's risk acceptance, but risk acceptance in the larger community that you work in with Zero Trust? Because we have to accept some level of risk with everything. You know, I think you said it's not a silver bullet, so something's going to get through. What's that level of risk that people are accepting right now with Zero Trust?
I can take this. So I think that there's a spectrum, right? So the authorization official, it's really up to their discretion, right? And so some are more conservative and some are more forward-leaning. You know, so you're seeing kind of that spectrum play out. Some people are doing zero trust things right now, today, you know, in production. Some are more kind of the traditional model.
I'd love to see the chaos.
Hi, Daniel Akers with Summit 7. How do you guys see MSPs supporting companies moving to Zero Trust when the MSPs have to bring their own devices to support the infrastructure?
Yeah, I think it's actually one and one. They actually go together. Again, in fact, we were talking about the idea that Zero Trust is a transactional thing across the entire flow. A BYOD should be part of your strategy, whether it's working within, you know, an MSP or even an organization that's providing you, you know, security to your OT or evaluation of your OT stuff. You know, that construct actually should work one and one. If you're not accounting for one, you're, again, not really doing zero trust because you're looking at everything as a trusted or untrusted, and that kind of needs to fade into the background.
Okay, we have a question here from Rachel McCaffrey, who I'd like to introduce. Rachel is our fearless defender at the national level at NDIA. She's come up to visit us here at the chapter. She's responsible for chapters and so much more. It's a pleasure to have you, Rachel. And
Thanks, Dan. I just want to, from an NDIA national perspective, throw out there that as they're going through CMMC 2.0, one of the things we're telling our members is don't wait. Do not wait for CMMC 2.0. CMMC 1.0 was going to give you, 3 years before solicitations were going to require that you got certification. We think, we don't know, but we think that when 2.0 comes out, there's not going to be that big of a timeline. So if you are not already working to be NIST standard compliant, you should probably do that. And then make sure you're prepared for whatever the government comes out with. I'm assuming that some of this zero trust language is going to be part of it. Like they said, there's no kind of one way to skin a cat. But you're going to have secure networks if you want to successfully compete for government contracts. So I just want to make sure people are not waiting. You're moving out on the NIST standards. And my question is, how prepared do you think we are in terms of cybersecurity with our allies, partners, and friends? So I fought the Libyan war as the ISR director, and I will tell you that the biggest problem that we have is information sharing with the countries who are equal partners in doing this. And I think that we are at least getting beyond admiring the problem, but are we including our friends, partners, and allies as we're moving forward?
You want to speak to that one?
before you answer that, you will have the advantage of grilling Stacy Bushjanik for as long as you like this afternoon on those questions about when you should be doing CMMC.
I'll make a couple quick comments. Like, the government is notoriously bad at sharing information, even internally among the government. You know, I still see that as a pervasive problem. But as Patrick mentioned, I think we are moving more and more in a direction of transparency, and I think it's a recognition by the department and the government that it's a big ecosystem. And in the supply chain security context, anything can be a point of attack vector, essentially, right? So you need to work as a cohesive ecosystem of partners, whether on the industry side or other nations, for example, to tackle that problem.
And I'll add, you know, from experience of working downrange and working in very large mission partner environments, and watching the difference between senior leaders like a McChrystal and a Petraeus, where one truly believed that openness and sharing was the key, and to do that then, because of the architectures, it just meant connect the networks and we'll figure out how to manage access later on. Then the other person was the exact opposite, deny by default, you know, but only allow by exception, which is a much harder model when you start with a blacklist and then try to whitelist things. I think what Zero Trust can bring to bear is, again, that abstraction of access and security away from where we try to manage it in the network and up into the application is what's really going to change things. Now, how we're going about currently with the government into making sure that we account for that in the strategy, I'm probably not the right person to answer because I'm not in the military anymore. But again, I think with a Zero Trust strategy, they're on the right path because it's inherent with each other.
Do we have any other questions?
Yes. Great. Over from the virtual side of the house, quick question. Where is CMMC reciprocity with FedRAMP, SOC, and the like?
I don't know if anyone else here is willing to take
The
that one.
cybersecurity, I've written about this. Like, the cybersecurity executive order speaks on the need for reciprocity, and Brian, Herman, who just spoke, talked about the role that cloud plays in helping achieve these objectives. And everyone knows that FedRAMP is a major bottleneck in that context. It's been around for 10 years. And it has like 260 services authorized in a market of thousands. So I think that we need to explore some level of reciprocity with SOC 2 and CMMC and other things like that. And that's going to be an impact on the DIB in terms of CMMC as well, because many small DIB vendors are going to be relying on cloud providers to help meet these objectives around CMMC and levels of maturity, for example. So I don't know where it's at in terms of being approved, but I know it has to be explored.
Yeah. And you're talking about workforce enablement earlier too. I see that as we're sort of in this transitional period where an organization might sit for a DIBCAC assessment. The assessment team shows up and you point them to cloud. And if they haven't encountered that before, there can be some friction there in trying to interpret some of the requirements in this cloud-first world. So I'm really interested to see where that goes in government and how long that period of transition takes. not only from a requirements perspective, but from a workforce enablement perspective and a familiarity to assess cloud-first technologies to those requirements.
Yeah, and I'll just give one example. So it is a totally different model. So one of the cloud providers we've worked with, traditionally the government does a pen test, right? So a penetration test. And so typically when they're doing that, they're thinking of infrastructure as a service. They're not thinking of PaaS services. So you think of like these serverless technologies. Are they going to do an effective pen test? What does that look like? So I think a lot of that is kind of rapidly changing. Yeah.
All right, question back here.
Hey guys, John McKenna with ACSC. First of all, great discussion. My question is, so Patrick, you mentioned the challenges with ITSM, right, and the siloed functions. Certainly can relate to that, trying to build that cross-function collaboration across apps and security and infrastructure and even the business. I guess my question is, first of all, how do you do that? And do you need a lead? And who should that be?
Yeah, so I'm not trying to claim I have the answer. I think in every business model and every industry and every whatever, they've always tried to figure out how to do a cross-functional approach. Even project management has a whole write-up on, do you realign people to project managers or cross-hybrid them across different functions? So I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all. I think it kind of comes down to what are the most motivating drivers of the business, and it could even be just at the time, unfortunately, where their strengths lie. I would offer that security is more and more going to be the lead, the guide, because in the past, I think the question before was how do you gauge risk and where to gauge risk? And in the past, it was a lot more of, I'm going to just keep assuming risk until I get slapped. Like, unfortunately, there was a lot more to lose by not taking risk and not being first or being operationally the most effective. And I think that's changing with all the threat landscape that's changed over the last 2.5 years, the attacks and all that kind of stuff. People aren't willing to take that risk because they're getting slapped a lot quicker, and therefore it's not worth it at a value proposition. I think security is slowly moving into that lead role of cross-functional, but it's also how can we abstract security functions out of people that own a different function that kind of contradict each other. Unfortunately, if you tell one person his role is to make something work really fast, but then tell him, but I'm going to tell you to limit it too, he's kind of stuck in a bind where it's like, well, I got to make my system run real fast, but you want me to make it slower, but I'm actually going to be graded on making it fast. You're going to be graded if it fails in security. And I think we're running into that where we can't do that anymore. That's that shared responsibility. You got to get to where one person owns it. And I think in the end, security is going to bubble up because that's the person that's going to end up being on the line.
Okay, we'll have one more. She's right here.
What guidance would you give to small businesses trying to compete for government contracts? So for example, like a 10 to 20 person machine shop. So the previous speaker mentioned maybe there's some cost savings for endpoint protections that aren't as relevant anymore. I think it was Chris, you mentioned focusing on kind of the low-hanging fruit like phishing and things like that, but that doesn't meet compliance standards. So what would you say to that 10 to 20 person machine shop or any small business in terms of what they need to expect to do in terms of budget to even be in the game for contracts in the future?
I would say, someone mentioned managed service providers earlier, and we talked about core competencies. You're a machine shop. Your core competency is in IT security, for example. So look into managed service providers, cloud providers, to offload some of those activities so you can actually focus on where your core competencies are and help you meet those compliance objectives much faster. You're still going to have some responsibility and activities that you need to do, but those individuals and groups are doing it at a scale where they can offer it at kind of economies of scale where it's affordable in many cases, where it'd be cost prohibitive for you to do some of these things yourself. So look to those partners is the best advice I can give, and then find one that has done it, right, and has a track record of being successful.
Okay, Ryan, you want to thank the panel?
That's great. Thank you all so much. I know this was a technical conversation. Appreciate that. We're definitely, as we transition through the rest of the program, going to bring it back up to a higher level. But thank you all so much for participating. This was great.
Thank you.